This video is sponsored by World Anvil. 2023 was a year. I spent it making videos mostly, so in December I took a break. I took some time off, did some other creative stuff, played some games, watched some movies, just didn't work on videos for a little while because I basically spent all of January through November pretty much only doing that. But now I'm back, I feel at least somewhat reinvigorated, and I figure what better way to come back than to talk about the art that 2023 gave us. I've compiled a list of 5 movies and 5 games because those were the 2 mediums I paid the most attention to in 2023. And I'm gonna go through each of them one by one and just talk about them a little bit. What about them I loved and resonated with. They won't be in any particular order, this isn't a ranked list, and I did try to give preference to stories that I don't plan on talking about in the future, so there might be some things you expect to see here that won't be here, and obviously I didn't watch or play everything that came out last year, and trust me, I missed a lot. Here's just a small sampling of the major releases I never got around to. So if something you loved isn't here, you can just assume that I haven't seen it if that makes things easier for you. And also, I'm going to be doing my best to avoid any major spoilers for anything I talk about, so feel free to watch this without worry. Other than that though, there's not much else to say. Except of course for this. This video is sponsored by worldanvil.com. I am allegedly a writer, have been since I was a kid, and my writing of choice was always fantasy, wizards and dragons and other such wonders. And world building is obviously a huge part of that process. That's why I find World Anvil such a great tool. World building is hard, intensive, and often confusing work, and there are so many features of World Anvil that a writer like myself can utilize to help plan, organize, and write a novel or some other kind of speculative fiction. You can create family trees to keep track of complicated genealogies or royal bloodlines, use interactive maps to help plan your characters' long journeys, build out timelines so you never forget important events in your world's history. On top of that, World Anvil has its own novel writing software, the ability to publish your work online for others to see and give feedback on, and you can even monetize your work. For me, the most useful part of World Anvil is just helping me keep track of everything. World Anvil helps to create order out of the chaos and give you something like a little wiki for your own imagined lore. So if you want to use these tools for your own world, you can go to worldanvil.com and use code StoryStreet to get 51% off any yearly subscription. Thanks to World Anvil for sponsoring, and now, without further ado, here are my favorite stories of 2023. I was a little worried going into John Wick Chapter 4, mostly because of its length, sitting at nearly 3 hours. One of my biggest criticisms of Chapter 3 was its length, and I can see why others would feel similarly about Chapter 4, but I don't. In fact, I so don't feel that way about Chapter 4 that I think it may very well be one of my favorite action movies I've ever seen. John Wick 4 is like a roller coaster ride, not in the sense that it's constantly going up and down and looping around, but in the sense that it has this consistent sense of forward momentum. It takes about 30 minutes for the movie's action to truly begin, but that 30 minutes feels like just the upward climb at the beginning of the ride, slowly but surely inching farther and farther up with you all too aware of what's coming. And then you reach the crest of the hill looking down and you drop. And from that point on, the ride never stops, never slows until it comes back around again to that upward climb to the next drop. But it's always, always moving forward. One of the things that impresses me the most about John Wick 4 is how it treats every little plot beat as an opportunity. While other action movies would have just conveniently forgotten that John isn't technically a part of the Ruska-Roma family anymore, or would have just found a way to write around it for the sake of the plot, John Wick 4 takes it as an opportunity to justify one of the craziest, most exciting, most visually stunning, and most mythic feeling action sequences that I have ever seen. What other movies see as an obstacle, something that needs to be written around or retconned out, John Wick 4 sees as an opportunity to do one of the coolest goddamn things you're ever likely to see in an action movie, all while never straying from the core foundations of what John Wick has always been: guns, knives, and cars. It feels no need to fall into more absurd stunt work that would require heavy uses of CGI, rather does it up the ante in more grounded, practical ways founded in the film's overall style and narrative. And through that, John Wick 4 comes films to truly realize the mythic ambitions of the first 3 films. The term Odyssey is probably overused in regards to not just film discussion in general, but just to John Wick as a franchise. But there is really no better way to describe it. This is an Odyssey, our modern Odyssey, Homeric in its scope, yet just as grounded in its characters as Homer's own epics were. This is a mythic tale of a man trying to find his way home, pushing through every tribulation, defeating all the forces that stand in his way, and overcoming all the trials that feel as though they are the essence of angry gods trying to keep him down. This is our modern epic, the true successor to Homer and Virgil and Dante. If John Milton, the man who wrote Paradise Lost, watched John Wick 4, he would have said, "This shit rocks." And in the end, this monument to excess, this joyfully violent action masterpiece, this gorgeous, slick, bloody testament to artistic passion and filmic craft, is a tale of resilience. It is a story about life and death, grief and regret, choices and consequences, and moving forward. Always forward. As a franchise, John Wick is simple. As elaborate as the choreography may get, and as convoluted as the justifications for these mind-blowing action sequences become, John Wick is simple. It is a story of a man trying to move forward through all the obstacles placed in his way. And that's something I think we can all relate to in one way or another. And John Wick Chapter 4 knows that well, and brings that story to the conclusion it always deserved. Here's the best way I can describe Paranormasight: The 7 Mysteries of Hanjo. It follows the story of various curse bearers, people who have one or more curse stones corresponding to one of the 7 mysteries of Hanjo. And also there are actually 9 mysteries for reasons. And these curse stones allow their bearers to use specific curses that can kill people if the right activation criteria is met, such as the victim turning their back to the curse bearer or lying to the curse bearer. And if you kill enough people and get enough soul dregs, you can bring someone back from the dead. But you get way more dregs for killing other curse bearers than non-curse bearers, and so the game becomes about finding other curse bearers and trying to get them to activate your curse, all while being careful not to activate theirs, and that's just how the game starts. What follows is a very dark story involving heavily implied sexual abuse by a teacher to a student, ritualistic child murder, and a serial killer, as 3 separate stories connected by these 7 mysteries begin to intertwine, and the truth of them and their corresponding curses is slowly but surely revealed. And it is quite the fucking trip. Paranormasight is a visual novel, so the story is really the star here. You switch between different timelines and different perspectives to get the full story of what's going on, and occasionally solve puzzles to progress. But most of what you'll be doing is reading, and reading, and reading, and reading. It's certainly not for everyone. If you're not a fan of visual novels, this is not the game that's going to make you one. And if anything, I honestly wish there was a little bit more in the way of interactivity. Those puzzles that force you to go between different timelines in order to get characters to certain places to reveal new information are great, but they're few and far between. There also aren't many choices to be made. There's technically more than one ending, but all of them are based on a singular choice, and because of the timeline mechanic, you can easily just go back and make a different choice. The different endings are mostly just there to give you more information to work with. And I know that you might be questioning at this point why I'm even talking about this game at all, but the main reason to play it is the story itself, because it's kind of a fantastic example of how to write a solid mystery story, particularly in a video game. As the different stories begin to intertwine, questions are answered one by one, and with the way that the game is designed around getting and evaluating information, most of the major twists come at just the right times for you to realize them just before they're revealed, allowing you to feel like you're figuring this mystery out as much as the characters are. The pacing is nigh on perfect, and I found myself extremely invested in the mystery at hand and putting all the pieces together. But the real reason that this game is on this list is because of the ending. I won't spoil it for you here, but the final twist was legitimately one of my favorite gaming moments of 2020. 2023. Not just because the twist itself is immaculately set up from the very opening moments of the game, but because the game itself actually forces you to figure it out yourself and type in the answer. You're not even given any choices, you just have to figure it out from the information available, and that made it 10 times more satisfying. And as a whole, it's a game about how stories change over time. The primary mystery surrounds figuring out how the 7 mysteries of Hanjo have been altered over the centuries that the stories have been shared. It's a story about not taking anything or anyone at face value and understanding that there's always more to people than meets the eye. Sometimes they're going through things you never knew about, living through horrible circumstances that provide context for how they've acted. And on the other side of the coin, people can be far worse than you ever expected, capable of terrible acts of violence and cruelty that you could never have even imagined. All in all, Paranormasight is not the best game of 2023, and I think it really only appeals to a very specific crowd. But I am definitely a part of that crowd, and if any of what I've said here interests you at all and you can stomach some of its darker themes, I think it's totally worth your time to play this weird, dark little supernatural mystery story. In my video about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, I said that Volume 3 would be my final MCU thing. And I've kept that promise, and it hasn't been hard. Most of that is simply due to the fact that very little, if anything, that the MCU did in 2023 was at all interesting to me. But it was also because, in many ways, Guardians of the Galaxy 3 was kind of the perfect way to say goodbye to the MCU. This epic tragicomic, this deeply sincere and unapologetic love letter to the flawed and the broken, this profoundly personal tale of loss and spirituality and moving on. It's messy and disjointed and maybe goes a little bit too far in trying to make you feel, but honestly, out of everything I've seen of the MCU from the very beginning to now, this movie has a bigger heart than any of them. And that's all I ever really wanted. It's a movie that cares so much. Every character here has an arc, every theme feels thoroughly explored, and by the end, it doesn't pretend to have answers about any questions that it has brought up. It doesn't pretend that any of this makes sense or that any of it was perfect. It simply is. And I can't imagine a better thing to leave the MCU behind on. Something imperfect, something that's too big and too long, but something that refuses to apologize for its flaws and that stands behind its characters and all of their flaws, accepting them as they are and supporting them as they try to grow and be better, while also acknowledging how difficult and confusing and endless that process is. Really, what I love the most about Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is how human it is, in spite of the fact that most of its characters aren't human. That's what I've loved about the entire Guardians trilogy, and at its best, it's what I loved about the MCU. In my Letterboxd review for the movie, I said the entire trilogy was about 2 things: dancing and fighting people with god complexes, and how beautiful I found that. And I was completely serious. This trilogy, and especially this movie, are about refusing power and embracing humanity, rejecting notions of perfect godhood and embracing the imperfections of human movement and art, all the missteps, all the holes, all the skipped stitches and awkward mistakes. This is a movie about growing and moving on, but it's also about never forgetting where you came from and who you are because of it. The MCU, for all its flaws, both modern and otherwise, had a major effect on me throughout my years of watching it. I like to think that it did have an impact and is in one way or another partly responsible for who I am now. I don't regret loving the MCU, and I won't forget it. All the good and the bad, the imperfect and the human. And Guardians of the Galaxy 3 will forever stand as a testament to that love, with Florence and the Machine's Dog Days Are Over being the final echoing note into the endless sky as I walk away. Season A Letter to the Future is a very quiet game. You play as an unnamed young woman setting out from your insular little town to go explore and document the world before the end of this season, when everyone will forget it. You ride your bike all across this land with a very soft slate of background music, or often no music at all, to better allow you to listen for sounds to record, look for images to capture, and people to talk to. And in that, it is a game that feels very different. It's a game designed for reflection, a game with long periods of just nothing. Season thrives on a certain level of ambiguity. It never explains or even implies what exactly the nature of seasons are. What little lore we get for the world is sparse and incomplete, and there really isn't much of a message. It doesn't feel like the game is trying to tell you anything specific. There's no right answer to Season, no correct interpretation, no best way to play. Season simply asks you to consider any of the many different themes that populate it and how you feel about them. It approaches ideas of death, grief, nature, war, religion, and memory. And everyone's experience of Season will be different, in spite of the fact that everyone has to go through generally the same things. And that's due to your journal. As you go throughout Season, you'll be taking pictures and recording sounds, and some of those are mandatory for progression, but the vast majority of images that will populate your pages will be yours and yours alone. What do you think needs to be remembered, and what do you think it's okay for people to forget? But what Season does is make everything feel just a little bit meaningful. The atmosphere allows certain mundane things a kind of quiet joy. I felt this weird calmness when jogging back to wherever I left my bike, or ringing its bell even though it had no real purpose. Pedaling the bike up a hill comes with a little bit of resistance from the adaptive triggers on PS5, just enough to not feel like you're actually struggling to pedal up a hill, but enough to evoke the memory of that experience in your own life. Every action, every moment feels meaningful in Season in a way that exceeds your understanding of it. And there's almost something humbling about it all, about the way that this moment right here is not only yours. It is shared by everyone in the world, and yet you are the only one who will experience it exactly the way that you are now. And so, as important as memory is in Season, there is nothing more important than experiencing the world as it is now, knowing that it one day won't be. In the end, it is a game about beauty and all of its many forms. There is a palpable sense of serenity and even joy that comes with the game's proceedings, an adoration for life itself and all that comes with it. It is a game about holding on to each and every moment and appreciating them as much as you possibly can before they are washed away in the flood of time. And it is a game about letting go of those moments as they pass and turning to confront the new moment as it comes in all its beauty, whatever that beauty may look like. And that's what makes it one of the most special gaming experiences I had in 2023. In many ways, Alexander Payne's The Holdovers is a movie that you've probably seen before. In fact, it is in many ways meant to evoke movies that you've probably seen before. The entire thing is a throwback to the cinema of the late 60s and 70s, being shot on film in a 1.66:1 aspect ratio with more grain than an actual granary. The movie was marketed like a movie from the 70s. It's written and performed like a movie from the 70s. If you showed someone this movie with absolutely no context, I'd bet you they would think it was from the 70s. Its commitment to capturing that essence is one of its most impressive and notable aspects, and its story is one that you've seen before. A curmudgeonly old professor and a troubled young student bonding and growing to understand and even care about one another over the holidays. And it is exactly the kind of story you can expect from that premise. It doesn't do anything really new or try to subvert your expectations or anything like that. It isn't desperately trying to be original or taking left turns every chance it gets for the sake of subversion. It is fully content with telling a story you've heard before, because originality is not its goal. Authenticity is. Every character in this movie is born from the bones of some old standing trope or another, but it's the strong writing and even stronger trio of central performances that stop them from ever slipping into caricature. Paul Giamatti's Hunnam is the old, cranky, strict professor, but he's also surprisingly surprisingly empathetic, clearly very intelligent, and critically is a sad, lonely man who knows how much he's hated, but has convinced himself it's better that way. And it's with that kind of depth that all of these characters are written. The Holdovers is a movie that stands unashamed of its unoriginality, of its cliches and its tropes, because the only real antidote to cliches is truth. If you can make a cliche feel true, feel authentic, then is it really a cliche at all? A ways into the movie, Hunnam tells Angus as they stand in a history museum,
"Each generation thinks it invented debauchery or suffering or rebellion, but man's every impulse and appetite, from the disgusting to the sublime, is on display right here."
And I don't think I could describe the primary thesis of this movie any better than that. There is nothing new in human experience. Originality is but a false idol. And to know ourselves, we must first look to and learn from the past. This film manages to capture that feeling of any classic holiday story in the making, that perfect blend of tenderness and melancholy, sadness and comfort, like a warm hug in front of the fire on a cold winter's night. It's what made It's a Wonderful Life. It's what made A Charlie Brown Christmas. It's what made A Christmas Carol. And it's what makes The Holdovers. It is a movie that is not trying to be anything new, not trying to reinvent the wheel or subvert expectations, because it knows that's not what it's here for. It's here to be that warm hug and to make everything feel alright, like all those movies that have come before it. It is not here to be original. It is here to be honest. I like to call myself a casual fan of Souls-like games, as in of FromSoft's Soulsborne type games. I've played the Demon Souls remake, Bloodborne, and Sekiro. And of those, I only really loved Sekiro, because that was more of a straightforward action game than an esoteric RPG. With the other two, I struggled to really feel strongly about them, because it's hard for me to get that into them. To do that, I feel like you have to obsess over any scraps of lore to appreciate the story, play the game through multiple times, trying multiple different builds to truly appreciate the combat and the many different systems built around it. And by the time I'm done with a single playthrough of any of them, I'm way too exhausted by them to want to play them again, even if overall I did enjoy the experience. I say all of this to explain why Lies of P wasn't really on my radar at the beginning of the year. I had heard of it, and it's hard to forget a premise as memorably absurd as Souls-like Pinocchio. But as memorably absurd as it was, my casual relationship with this genre made it to where that didn't really sound all that interesting to me. Until one day in early June, I was just screwing around on the PlayStation Store and on a total whim decided to download and play the demo for Lies of P. And by the time I was done with this surprisingly large demo, I almost immediately pre-ordered it, because I had kind of fallen in love with it. There's a lot to love about Lies of P. The La Belle Époque aesthetic, the tight and intuitive controls and combat mechanics, the absolutely gorgeous visuals. It takes a lot of clear inspiration from FromSoft's catalog, with the loudest inspiration coming from Bloodborne and things like the more fast-paced and aggressive combat, the very gross design of some of the bosses, and a similar visual aesthetic. But I'd argue that while the influence from Sekiro is quieter, it's just as substantial. The clearest influences in the game's focus on timed blocks, but it's also in things like how your health items reset upon dying or reaching checkpoints, or in its more straightforward story. And frankly, it's that more straightforward approach to the storytelling, along with the much more apparent world building, that really made me fall in love with Lies of P. Unlike stuff like Bloodborne, where you're pretty far removed in time from when everything went to shit, Lies of P has you in the fairly recent aftermath. And so, basically every character that you meet is still, to some extent or another, having to react and get used to how the world has changed around them. The tragedies they've suffered as a result of what's happening are still fresh in mind. The people and homes they've lost. In Bloodborne or Demon Souls, the most interesting stories are the ones that happen decades or even centuries before the start of the game. But in Lies of P, those stories are happening in front of your eyes. Those people are right there, rather than in some item description or some hidden dialogue from someone who wasn't wasn't even there. For example, there's the story of Adelina the actress, a short side quest where you encounter Adelina, a famous singer and actress currently dying from a thing called petrification disease, and in her dying hours she laments her greatest regret, poisoning her own sister, known in the game only as the White Lady, in order to destroy her singing voice, a voice she was jealous of, and her sister never knew, only ever pouring more and more adulation onto her, piling on the guilt of Adelina's deed until now, after you've killed the White Lady not long before.
Attire as your sister. As promised, we always match.
She fought you for Adelina, never knowing the truth of what she did to her. And now Adelina sits here slowly dying, wanting only for a final taste of fruit, and to confess what she's done before it's too late. And that is just one of the many stories you can find throughout the world of Krot. Only two of the many characters you'll find in this nightmare. Much has been made, deservedly so, of Liza P's gameplay and overall design, but it's stuff like the story of Adelina and the White Lady that made me adore this game, and it's what made me consider a second playthrough even after having played the game for 50 plus hours already. It was the world and the characters and the story that it told of horror and tragedy and lies, ranging from the deeply personal ways we lie to ourselves to the lies told by those who hold the greatest power in society. And so even when certain bosses make me go, holy fuck, why do I even try, I still loved every minute of my time with Liza P, and I eagerly await its DLC and eventual sequel. When Celine Song's film Past Lives begins, we are met with a long take, the camera slowly zooming in on a conversation between three people as we hear unidentified voices speculate on who these three people are and what their relationship is to each other. The shot lasts for a full minute as the two men on the sides begin to disappear into the edges of the frame, and all we can see is the woman in the middle. The rest of the movie is essentially how these three different people all came to be at this spot at this time, and I think this single opening shot is a perfect microcosm for the entire film, its style, its themes, and its emotional focus. Past Lives is about lingering, built on these long takes, these slow zooms and pans, allowing you the chance to notice the slightest changes in expression and the smallest movements of the body. The two main performances are mostly body language, in fact, those signs of discomfort or those involuntary spasms of joy. Past Lives lives in those minute details, those lingering moments accompanied by all the feelings that live in the same place. And through them, you get these quiet moments of characterization, this subtle but undeniable understanding of who these people are, what they fear and want and why. Past Lives is about what separates us, geography, time, culture, language, the barriers that stand between us and other people, the many things that keep us apart. And we sit as people watchers at bars, noticing others but never bridging the gap for a whole host of reasons. We are aware somewhere deep down that they are their own person, moving through their own stories, experiencing their own hardships. But for now, they are merely visuals in the play that are our immediate surroundings, background characters to our own narratives. Past Lives is about heartbreak. It's about lamenting the lives we never lived, the choices we never made, the fates that were not ours. It is a movie that is deeply melancholic, but also strangely kind of comforting. A movie that pats you on the back and tells you that it's okay to grieve what never was. It's okay to be sad that we didn't do what we wanted to do. It's okay and natural to regret choices we've made. But that's all the more reason to appreciate love when it's here. Because for all the things that separate us, there are so many things that connect us to one another, even for just brief moments. The strong, perhaps spiritual strings that tie us to one another. And in the midst of the heartbreak, the singular message of Past Lives is to allow yourself to linger. to allow yourself to sit with the pain and the regret, to not love it or hate it or judge it at all, but to instead simply allow it to exist, to let it be and to let it go until that day when it comes back around again. But even then, there is a beauty to it. An odd sort of comfort and a sense of appreciation that comes with the knowledge that we can feel. We are living in what is perhaps the golden age of video game remakes. Remakes are not a new phenomenon. Games have been remade for newer hardware since the inception of newer hardware, but they've never been more prolific or more high profile than within the last 10 years, as classic games like Shadow of the Colossus and Crash Bandicoot are given new life and brought to modern audiences, and other experiences are completely redone and redefined, like with Final Fantasy VII Remake and, of course, the Resident Evil remakes. We're currently in something of a renaissance period for the Resident Evil franchise. Ever since Resident Evil 7 brought the series back to its roots in 2017, most everything that Capcom has done with this franchise has been exceptional. Resident Evil Village was a perfect continuation and celebration of the franchise and all of its many identities over the years, while the remake for Resident Evil 2 is one of my all-time favorite games, and the remake for Resident Evil 3, while being the weakest of the bunch in my opinion, is still a fantastic reimagining of one of my least favorite games in the series. Resident Evil is on a roll, but when it was announced that the next game getting a remake would be Resident Evil 4, I must admit I was a little bit skeptical for a couple of reasons. One, I even now maintain that Resident Evil 4 is the least interesting game of the franchise to remake. I mean, we still haven't even gotten a Code Veronica remake. But two, I'm not actually the biggest fan of the original Resident Evil 4. Don't get me wrong, I respect the hell out of it. It's one of the most influential games ever created and essentially ushered in a completely new era of action games, but God, is it way longer than it needs to be. If it was like half the length, I'd love it a lot more, but it gets so exhausting by the end, going for 20 hours without any real shift in its core gameplay loop. It's ridiculous. But with those reservations at hand, I still bought and played through the entirety of the Resident Evil 4 remake, and I got what may very well be my favorite game in the entire franchise. Because like its predecessors, this is not a remake that just recreates the original game with new graphics and calls it a day. No, this is a complete reimagining of the original, a completely new game built on the same foundation, and in my opinion, an incredible improvement. It's little things like being able to stealth kill enemies. Sure, it's probably impossible to stealth your way through the entire game or even entire sections, but it adds a completely new dimension to how you approach combat encounters. The addition of knife parrying adds a completely new dynamic to gameplay as well, and I don't know if it was just me or not, but the areas felt so much more open. Each environment feels so much more dynamic and gameplay feels so much more fluid, and I'm having to make so many more decisions on the fly and utilize all of my resources rather than relying on only a few. But one of the biggest and most impressive improvements is to the game's story. In the original, the story is nigh on a straight up comedy, and there's nothing wrong with it, but it's very much just there to help justify whatever the hell you're doing. A fun action horror movie context. But here, I mean, it's no Last of Us or anything, but by Resident Evil standards, it's surprisingly strong. Like, imagine Luis actually being kind of likable. Imagine Ramon Salazar kind of having depth. Imagine Ashley having a fucking personality. Like, can you even imagine it? Ashley actually kind of giving a shit about her well-being, can you imagine? Not to mention that it perfectly blends together the original's more tongue-in-cheek tone with the previous remake's more serious sensibilities. Leon still has a bunch of stupid one-liners, the game is still ridiculous, but it takes itself just that little bit more seriously. Its characters, for the most part, aren't just jokes and meme material anymore. They're actually likable and sympathetic and fully formed. Really, at the end of the day, Resident Evil 4 Remake is just fucking fun. I had a blast with this ridiculous action horror game, and by the end of my 20+ hours with it, I didn't feel exhausted, but just fulfilled. There's always a game like this for me every year, a game that doesn't do anything truly mind-blowing or give me a truly profound emotional experience, but what it does do is give me the feeling of being a kid playing video video games again. The pure excitement that came with just thinking about when I'd get my hands back on a controller so that I could continue to experience it. There's a simplicity there, a joy that doesn't come nearly as often as it did when I was younger, and it's a joy that I cherish whenever it comes around. In the past, that game has been Spider-Man PS4, it's been Link's Awakening, it's been Metroid Dread, but in 2023, that game that continued to excite me with each new encounter, that game I couldn't wait to get my hands on each and every day, that game that inspired in me more pure joy than any other in 2023, was the remake of Resident Evil 4. Alan Wake 2 begins with you playing as a naked man washing up on the shore of Cauldron Lake in the middle of a rainy night. You stumble through a thick forest as vague sounds surround you and terrifying images of a man screaming plague you, and eventually you encounter a group of cultists in deer masks who tie you to a picnic table, kill you, tear out your heart, and leave your cold, lifeless body behind, and it only gets weirder from there. Take it from somebody who likes but doesn't love the original Alan Wake 2 is perhaps one of my favorite video game narratives of the last 10 years, maybe even of all time. I played this game for about 30 hours or so, and at no point during that time was I not being consistently and thoroughly entertained, shocked, and or heavily impressed by just about everything Alan Wake 2 was doing. It is, at every twist and turn, an incredibly unique, wonderfully weird, beautifully absurd, and thought-provoking piece of gaming horror, and an instant classic of its genre that makes its predecessor feel like nothing more than a rough draft at best. The atmosphere is more measured and diverse, the narrative beats feel more purposeful and driven, the world of Bright Falls feels so much more alive, like a genuine community through multiple side stories emerging from collectibles, or even just listening in on NPC conversations throughout the game, making the stakes of this story feel that much more real as you see how everything is affecting not just Alan or Saga, but everyone. The game is an incredibly impressive balancing act, slipping so effortlessly from comedy to drama, lighthearted fun to nuanced and unflinching thematic exploration. At one point you have the delightfully silly Koskela Brothers commercials, and at another point you're confronting the darkness of a woman who dedicated her life to the work of a man who never gave a damn about her. It manages, through mostly the same mechanics, to give you two completely different yet essential horror experiences through the separate campaigns of Saga Anderson and Alan Wake. Saga's is a more traditional modern survival horror experience, more exploratory and grounded in the characters, particularly Saga herself as she grapples with her role in a story written by someone else. Whereas Alan's is a delightful piece of absurdist psychological horror, more on rails than Saga's story, but also more meta and difficult to pin down exactly, as Alan explores his own responsibility as an artist and how his actions and his stories have affected other people. And that's really what Alan Wake 2 is about how art does not exist in a vacuum. It is created in response to how the artist engages with the world around them, but it is also something that can have a profound impact on the world itself. That is the primary metaphor of both these games, taking the concept of art's power to influence the world and pushing it to a literal level. But this game not only explores that theme more successfully in my opinion, it also expands on it greatly by grounding that influence in more personal narratives, showing the negative effects of art produced for selfish intent, art that does not consider its potential impact on others, art written solely for the artist. And the arcs of our two main characters develop around that primary thematic content, coming to a head in much more satisfying and powerful ways than in the original. This is a game that I would recommend to everybody, but I would especially recommend it to any kind of artist, because the conversation this game is having is an essential one that any prospective artist must engage with before they can begin to make art honestly. In all its wonderful strangeness, its darkly comic elements, its splendid absurdity, it is a beautifully human tale about coming to terms with our place in other people's stories. Whether we are terrified victims to our dark presences, unwitting monsters answers to those we've overlooked, or heroes looking to rise above the stories we're trapped inside. And I'm eager to see what Remedy could create if they were allowed to make this into a trilogy, because I honestly believe that with it, they could make the whole thing one of the greatest examples of interactive narrative and its infinite amount of artistic potential. Something they've already delivered to us in part with this, my favorite game of 2023. When it comes to my favorite movie of the year, it should probably be Past Lives, because there was no other movie this year that made me feel more than that movie, and that's honestly what I value most in art. But there's just something about Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. There's some indescribable quality to it, something almost divine, or perhaps demonic, who really knows. There's just something about it that goes beyond my capacity to fully understand my relationship with it, as though Nolan has tapped into such a pure artistic and emotional aesthetic that to try and understand it with any amount of certainty is folly in and of itself. But I'm going to at least try. The strange thing is that Nolan has always been a director I've respected more than I've loved. I respect The Prestige, I respect Dunkirk, I respect Batman Begins, but I don't necessarily like any of those movies. Not to say I dislike them, just to say that my feelings toward them are more academic than personal, with the biggest exceptions being Inception, Interstellar, and of course, Oppenheimer. And when it comes to Oppenheimer, I think the main reason that it so grabs me is Oppenheimer himself. I don't know if it's just because Nolan is pulling from a historical source, or if it's almost entirely in Cillian Murphy's performance, or if it's a little bit of both, probably a little bit of both, but J. Robert Oppenheimer is far and away the most fascinating, captivating, and emotionally complex character that Nolan has ever written. It's been one of his biggest weaknesses throughout his career, but here, Nolan has crafted from this historical figure one of American film's great characters, and he needed to. This is a character study, after all, told primarily through Oppenheimer's subjective perception of the world around him, and it's in that we find an incredibly contradictory figure. Deeply flawed, oddly sympathetic, and yet strangely sinister. He is a man who wants to be pitied, but who knows full well he does not deserve to be. He is a man who wants to be important, but believes he isn't exceptional enough to be. He is a man who built a bomb he ended up not wanting to use. And Oppenheimer explores every nook and cranny of this contradiction psyche, his disturbances and his aspirations and his fears and his desires, crafting a portrait not just of a tormented man, but a tormented world, making scientific advancements faster than it can understand the implications of them, building weapons that can destroy the world because they fear someone else will do it first. The film makes the personal global and the individual universal, taking a single infinitely complex man and using him as a representative for the fears, flaws, and self-destructive tendencies of an entire world while never quite losing sight of the man himself, managing to deftly balance the dual roles of its main character. I think the reason why it's my favorite movie of the year is because it manages to feel so personally engaging at the same time that it achieves a sense of universal importance, much the same way as Oppenheimer's bomb. It mattered to him on a very personal level, but it went so far beyond him, and that was one of his greatest mistakes, not realizing what his personal ambition would realize until it was too late. And we watch it happen, this powerful undercurrent of dread born from the first spark and remaining uninterrupted to the very end and beyond. And that's it. It was an interesting year, to say the least. I watched more movies that came out in 2023 than I have ever watched in any other year. And many of the ones I talked about here, I would have allowed myself to miss in any other year. I wouldn't have watched Past Lives or The Holdovers or even Oppenheimer in most other years, but I did this year. And I now feel a strange sense of regret for all those other years. And I feel sort of similarly about the games as well. I probably wouldn't have touched Lies of P or Season or Paranormasight in other years. Hell, I don't even know that I would have played Alan Wake 2. I went outside my comfort zone in art last year, and in 2024, I want to go even further if I can. Not just in art, but in my own life. I feel like I became much more insular in 2023. I worked on videos and stayed inside mostly. I kind of didn't have a lot of human interaction last year, which I think probably wasn't good, and it was through art that I got to explore the world and engage with new people and new ideas. And this year, I really want to try and do more of that outside of art. If stories have taught me anything throughout the years, it's that there is so much in life to experience, and so much of it is missable if you don't seek it out. And so I want to broaden my horizons in 2024, artistically and intellectually and emotionally. I want to push myself. I want to get out there and see both the bad and the beauty of the world, and allow myself a chance to linger in it and feel it without the barrier of a screen. And I really, really hope that I'm not saying this same thing next year too, but that's up to me, I guess. So here's to 2024, to all the art that people will make and the truths that they will share, all the human stories told, all the pain and joy felt. Here's to new experiences, both good and bad, and trying to find beauty in them all.